Good evening. I'm Michelle DePass, Dean of the Milano School of International Affairs, Management, and Urban Policy, and the Director of the Tishman Environment and Design Center here at the New School. Welcome. The New School is delighted to host another Times Talk with the New York Times. It's our 46th event together since 2003. Our collaborations with Time Talks reflect the New School's dedication to addressing cultural and social issues and supporting creative expressions in the arts, social sciences, and media. Tonight's event is also much more closely related to topics that I am passionate about and actively working on, not just with our environmental studies and environmental policy and sustainability management programs here in Milano and environmental science programs at Lang and elsewhere at the New School, but also with my work at the Tishman Center, where we strive to integrate design, policy, and social justice approaches to advance environmental issues. I'm honored and pleased that we share this passion for the environment and for conservation. And I hope that your interest and passions for these ideas, which brought you here tonight, grows as well. Please welcome Michelle Gray, the Director of Programming at Times Talks. Thank you for coming.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Michelle Gray, the Director of Programming for the New York Times live conversation series Times Talks, which pairs New York Times journalists with the brightest and boldest creative minds from the fields of film, theater, music, art, fashion, literature, and science. We'd like to give a special thank you to our longtime collaborators, the New School, who are hosting this evening's talk in their beautiful space. I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's event with Dr. Jane Goodall, a visionary primatologist, anthropologist, and UN Messenger of Peace, and Brett Morgen, acclaimed documentary filmmaker. Morgen's new documentary, Jane, draws from over 100 hours of never-before-seen footage of Goodall, a woman whose chimpanzee research challenged the male-dominated scientific consensus of her time and revolutionized our understanding of the natural world. Moderating tonight's conversation is New York Times culture reporter Milena Rysick, who wrote the story on Dr. Goodall for the Times last month. Please join me in giving a very, very warm welcome to Milena Rysick, Brett Morgen, and Jane Goodall.
Hello. Is this me?
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I am so thrilled, and I can see that you guys are also so thrilled to be here with Dr. Jane Goodall and Brett Morgen. We're going to have a great time talking, and we'll have a little bit of time for you all to ask some questions towards the end. I'll let you know, and there'll be mics so everybody can hear you. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you both for joining me. It's wonderful to see you. You guys have a new film that we're going to talk about. And Jane, can I call you Jane?
Please.
Okay. I wanted to start by asking you, you realized early on in your career that you were going to have to be an advocate for animals and for the environment and for preservation. You've been in a lot of films. And I wonder if you could tell us why you decided to be in this film.
Well, I was actually pushed into this film because there had been so many already that I said, well, what, another one? Another documentary about me and the chimps, come on. And then people were saying, well, it'll be good publicity, and we're always, the Jane Goodall Institute's always after money because of all our projects in Africa. And so I said, oh, all right. And they said, it's only going to be 3 hours of interview. That's all you have to do. But that wasn't too bad, I thought. But, go on, it's your turn.
Oh, okay, yeah. I kind of was like Jane. I was a little reluctant when I was first approached, which was really based in nothing but naivete, that I knew that there were a bunch of films about Jane. But when I started looking at them, I realized that there was an opportunity to do something quite different, to take this footage from nearly 60 years ago and use it in a way to create a very kind of immersive documentary, to invite the audience to experience Gombe the way Jane did back in the 60s. Right, Jane?
Right.
And Brett, you told me that your first question to Jane when you sat down for those 3 hours or more of interviews was
3 days.
Well, no, it's actually, before the first question of the interview, the first thing I said to Jane, if you've seen the movie or the trailer, Jane looks, she's sitting out in the sun all day, every day for months on end. And I don't know if you remember this, but my first question when we were introduced was I ran up to you and I was like, you're going to kill me, but I have to ask you, did you bring sunscreen with you to Gombe? And Jane was not amused. She's laughing now, but she was not amused. She was like, who is this fool National Geographic has sent to me? Which didn't get better because when we started the interview, I said to Jane, do you get tired of telling your story? And she looked at me again with no smile and said, well, it depends on who's asking the questions. She laughs now.
We hadn't met at that time. The first time we met was for this interview in Tanzania. So.
And so, but Brett, you realized right away that, as an interview subject, as many stories as Jane has to tell, she wasn't going to suffer any fools.
No, and that's, I think, one of the things about her interview in the film that makes it so special is that of all the people I've ever interviewed in my life, I don't think I've ever met anyone as straightforward and unpretentious as Jane. And usually when you're doing an interview, the subject generally has an agenda. And Jane, had no agenda. And I think it shows in the film. Her honesty comes through. And I think it's even coming wherever we go, and we've had these wonderful experiences together, right, Jane?
Right.
With the film and with... She's so nonplussed. It's like we go to the Hollywood Bowl. Jane, are you excited? It's the Hollywood Bowl. There's 18,000. No, but it's like whether there's 30 people or 18,000. I think you approach everything the same, which is, I think, remarkable.
Did you find anything different about watching this film? Did you learn anything?
Oh yeah, it was absolutely, completely different from any other documentary. It took me back into those early days in a way none of the other films have. And I think it's completely honest. There's no attempt to tidy it up and bend it into, it just is as it was.
Because one of the things about some of the earlier films is they were not very accurate.
They weren't all very accurate, no.
And what was that like for you to experience?
Well, it
your
was
work?
awful. I mean, the first geographic film, that Miss Goodall and the Wild Chimpanzees, it had so many inaccuracies. And by the time I saw it, the film was, what do you call it? Set, tied, locked.
Locked.
Yes. The film was locked. But the commentary could be redone. And so Orson Welles was the narrator. And so I had a wonderful little tiny family lawyer from England, and he tackled the mighty geographic. Pretty amazing. And forced them to re-record the narration. Well, by that time, Orson Welles had broken a leg skiing, and they had to take the whole caboodle out to a hospital in Switzerland.
So not only did you give Orson Welles direction, you made him work from his own hospital bed.
Well, I wasn't there. I mean,
those are details. Let's watch the trailer. I know some of you have probably already seen the film, but for those of you who hadn't, let's take a look at the trailer.
Day after day, in the sun and the wind and the rain, I climbed into the hills. This was where I was meant to be. I learned, the more I realized how like us they were.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and fiction can be transformed into prophecy. Here we have a perfect example of that evolution.
Jane Goodall, tall, blonde, and beautiful.
Living with the chimpanzees in the wilds of Africa.
Were you ever really very frightened?
I thought they were nicer than us. I had no idea of their brutality.
What about the significance of the studies?
There were some who tried to discredit my observations because I was a young, untrained girl.
I didn't care what anybody said.
They would be sending out a photographer to document the chimpanzees. We both loved being out in nature, and we both loved the work we were doing. We just got on very well.
Then just like that, Geographic ended the funding. It was very upsetting, unfortunate and sad. And it was like, well, what do we do?
How long are you going to be associated with the chimpanzee?
Until I die.
So one of the things you can tell from the trailer, there's a little bit of a note there that, you know, some of the headlines that they focus on in the trailer, that they're about the fact that you were not just a scientist, but a woman. In fact, some of the headlines say, woman scientist, as though that was a notable thing, because at the time it was. There wasn't such a thing. But what I found interesting is that you didn't actually even want to be a scientist.
No, because, well, how could I when the women scientists didn't exist? Hardly, anyway. I wanted to be a naturalist. I wanted to go to Africa. I wanted to live with wild animals and write books about them. I always wanted to write.
Yeah. And Louis Leakey, who invited you to come to Africa, wanted...
No, he didn't. No. I was invited by a school friend. And I was working in London at the time, actually in a documentary film studio. And I didn't have any money, so I went home and worked as a waitress. Finally had enough money for the return fare to Africa by boat in those days. That was so magical, you know. And it was while I was out there that, staying with my friend, I heard about Louis Leakey. Somebody said, if you're interested in animals, you should meet Louis. And that's how it all began.
But he was interested in having somebody who was an amateur join.
He was. He didn't tell me at the time, but he subsequently said, I wanted somebody whose mind is unbiased by scientific clutter or rubbish or whatever it was he said, but he didn't tell me at the time.
Did you think that you had some kind of leg up because you didn't have scientific training? There was no playbook for you to follow.
I didn't think about it. I just knew he was giving me a chance to do something I'd always wanted to do. And, you know, what do you do when you study an animal? You get the animal used to you. You're patient, you watch it, and you write everything down. There was no other way of doing it.
Well, at the time, though, even that kind of study was unusual.
It was basically not done. So when I finally got to Cambridge University to do a PhD without a primary degree, I was told I'd done everything wrong. You shouldn't have given the chimps names. They should have had numbers. That's science. And you couldn't talk about them having personality or mind or emotion. Only humans have those things. Well, I'd had a dog as a child called Rusty, and he was a very special dog. But if you share your life in a meaningful way with any animal, you know perfectly well that, you know, I was nervous of those professors. They knew so much. But in this respect, I knew they were wrong. I had also had a mother who was so supportive, and she'd, I suppose, given me that self-confidence that I just knew I couldn't change.
So that was something that propelled you, that those childhood experiences propelled you into a place that not only no women went to, but really no people went to do the kind of work that you were doing. Did you ever have any sense of doubt or any what we now call imposter syndrome, that maybe you didn't belong there?
No, I always knew I belonged there. What worried me, Leakey managed to get money for 6 months, because who was going to give money for this ridiculous thing, And so what I worried about was the chimps ran away every time they saw me. And would I be able to find out enough information before the money ran out? Because if I didn't, that would be the end. But, fortunately, I saw this one chimp, David Greybeard, using a twig as a tool and stripping leaves and making a tool. And that one observation, because at the time it was thought that humans and only humans used and made tools, that brought in the National Geographic, who said, yeah, we'll go on funding this research. And they sent Hugo van Lauwijk, whose footage is what we just saw in the trailer. So that's how it all began.
Yeah. We'll have some clips of that in a little bit, but I wanted to go back to the idea that you didn't want to be a scientist and you wanted to be a naturalist. You wanted to observe animals in a way that we now understand is the way to work with them, but at the time was totally out of left field. Tell me a little bit more about how you dealt with any kind of scientific, the institutional blowback when you said, no, these creatures have personalities, they should have names.
Well, two things. As I told you, the dog taught me that animals did. But secondly, my supportive mother. And so, as I didn't want, I was only doing the PhD because Louis Leakey said I needed it. Not because I actually wanted the degree. I just knew I had to do it. He said, you won't be able to get money otherwise, and I won't be always around. So, I knew I was right. And fortunately, I had a really wonderful supervisor. And he started off being my sternest critic, but then he came to Gombe, and he said, Jane, in 2 weeks, I've learned more about animal behavior than the rest of my life. And so he's the one who taught me how to express all these ideas and all these observations and think in a scientific way. And I really, really was so grateful. I love this logical way of thinking, and it's the way you put things makes such a difference.
Yeah. And Brett, you said that as a filmmaker, you found some kinship with the way that Jane observed her subjects. That's how you approached making documentaries, is that right?
Yeah, well, when I started making documentaries, even to this day, to a certain extent, people expect us as documentarians to be objective, whatever that implies. And I never really bought into that, because I always figured when you bring a camera into a situation, you're altering the situation as it is. And so my approach has always been what I call intensive immersion, which is to try to present the world through my subject's perspective, which is the opposite of objectivity to a certain extent. And so when I was reading In the Shadow of Man, and in many respects, Jane is a direct adaptation of In the Shadow of Man. I think that it takes narrative a little further, but that was certainly my script, if you will. When I read In the Shadow of Man and I read about Jane's approach to her work, that was my entry into this film. I just immediately felt a kinship. And then I think as the film evolved and as it got deeper and deeper into it, I became very enamored with the love story. And the love story with Jane, both with Jane and Hugo, as well as Jane and her work. And I just, I think that Jane's story is, it's amazing because it's most of our film is rooted from about 45 years ago, but it feels so contemporary to themes that we're dealing with today, and that it's just timeless as well.
And one thing that I enjoyed about the film, you guys say in the trailer, it's based on 100 hours of unseen footage that was shot by Hugo in the 60s for National Geographic. But Brett, did you change any of the footage? Did you do anything to the coloring of it, anything like that?
Well, the footage was perfectly preserved in terms of it was stored in an air-conditioned vault, but the colors had degraded a bit. and there was no sound to any of the footage, and we had 140 hours, but it was 140 hours of individual shots. It was, there was no continuity from one shot to the next. So when we started to screen the footage, I was assuming it would be camera reel 1, camera reel 2, camera reel 3. Instead, the thing comes on, and the first shot is Jane walking left to right across the frame. The next shot was a baboon. The next shot was an insect. The next shot was a banana. The next shot was a chimp eating for 140 hours. I think we called Nat Geo at that point and said, can we return the footage to you? And we haven't spent that much yet. So we set up, we built a sound room at our office because I knew that we had no sound elements, and to create an immersive experience, we would have to work very hard to achieve it. So we started working in 7.1 2.5 years ago. And then what I find so interesting is Jane talks often about how this film captures her experience of Gombe better than any of the other films. And I really think a lot of that has to do with 3 things. One is that I used her book as my blueprint. So my visualization of Gombe was rooted in Jane's subjective interpretation of Gombe. And the way Jane describes Gombe in her book, it's a magical place. When we looked at the footage of Gombe, a lot of the footage was brown or green. It was just brown or green. It didn't really have the palette that I thought Jane sort of experienced. And so we set about trying to present those images through Jane's perspective, through Jane's eyes, to try to introduce an element of almost magical realism. You know, as we got deeper into the film, Philip Glass came on board and spent 6 months composing music. And when he finished his music, we went back and re-edited the entire film to choreograph all of the animal movements as well as their vocalizations. We pitched those to be in sync with the music. And the idea was not to do a Disney film so much as we wanted Gombe to be the magical place it was for Jane. And so to flash forward and to have Jane see the film for the first time and say that this really captures it, I do feel a tremendous amount of that had to do with both technological advances as well as just not imposing a narrative upon her and her work and Hugo's work, and being sensitive to her work. You see, Jane, on top of everything else, if anyone, I'm sure a lot of you have had an opportunity to read her writing, she's an amazing writer. I mean, incredible. I think it's one of your greatest gifts, second to speaking and being a great orator. And one of our great discoveries was finding Jane had done a series of book on tapes, including Reason for Hope. And so a lot of the narration of the film was taken from Jane's book on tape, because for me, that was a pure expression of Jane's. That was her art. So we're watching Hugo's art, and we're trying to mirror it with Jane's artistry.
And Jane, you probably liked it because then you didn't have to narrate it as much in real time now, right?
There were times where the editor, because Jane was not, she was busy saving the world, so she wasn't doing narration for us. So we would have to sometimes cut some stuff together, and my editor would disappear, and I'd be like, time would go by, a day or two would go by, and I'd be like, where did you go? And he's like, I'm trying to get these 2 words to cut together. And then we'd be like, oh my God, just imagine, Jane could do this in 20 seconds. Jane was busy.
She's busy.
Which I respect.
Well, because remember, 3 hours only of my time. Nobody told me about all this stuff that we're doing now.
It's so true.
Hollywood bowls. And
Let's watch another important moment from the film, an important moment in the film and in your life.
Louis Leakey sent me to Gombe because he believed that an understanding of chimpanzees in the wild would help him to better guess how our Stone Age ancestors may have behaved. It had long been thought that we were the only creatures on Earth that used and made tools. Man the toolmaker is how we were defined. here was David Greybeard using a tool. It was hard for me to believe what I'd seen. A few days later, I watched, spellbound, as Chimp set off to a termite mound, picked a small leafy twig, then stripped it of its leaves. That was object modification, the crude beginning of tool making. It had never been seen before. When I telegrammed the news to Louis Leakey, he responded that we must now redefine man or accept chimpanzees as human. My observations at Gombe would challenge human uniqueness, and whenever that happens, there is always a violent uproar. There were some who would try to discredit my observations because I was a young, untrained girl and should therefore be disregarded. The result of it all, however, was that Louis was able to obtain a grant from the National Geographic Society to continue my study. In addition, they would be sending out a photographer to document the chimpanzees.
So can you take us back to that moment when you saw David Greybeard making that tool and using it? Did you realize in that instant how earth-shattering that would be, or did you just think, this is a one genius chimp?
No, I knew, that we were supposed to be man the tool maker. So I knew that this was very exciting. But I'd read, there's a wonderful book called Mentality of Apes by Wolfgang Kohler. He studied a colony of captive chimps, and he described them using tools. Well, science decided that was just because somehow our intelligence had rubbed off on them. See, that's how science was back then. So I wasn't surprised, but I was excited because I knew that this was going to make a big impression on the science of the time.
Did you tell anyone before you sent that telegram?
No, do you know, well, first of all, I waited to see it again and again because I couldn't quite believe I'd seen it. But it was just 2 weeks after my mother had left. And that was when I discovered that when you see something really exciting, it's really important to share it with somebody. It's like a little kid and they have a treat and they want to run up and they hug you, and there was nobody to share it with. I mean, they had the cook and the boat driver, and they were interested, but they weren't excited because to them it was just, well, why wouldn't they use tools, So.
That's interesting because you mentioned your mother being there, and explain to the audience why she was there with you.
Oh, well, when Louis Leakey wanted me to go and study the chimps, he, first of all, had to get money. And that was difficult because who was going to give money for this young, untrained girl from England? That he finally got six months' money from an American businessman. He actually had a tool-making factory. He was interested in tools, like Leakey was. And then the second problem was that back then, what we call Tanzania today was Tanganyika, was part of the crumbling British Empire. And they said they wouldn't take responsibility for a girl on her own going into the forest. They went on and on saying no, and Leakey never gave up. So in the end, they said, all right, she can come, but she can't come alone. She's got to come with someone. So I think it was Leakey who twisted Mum's arm because he wanted somebody with me who wouldn't compete, who wouldn't try to influence me in any way. And he knew that's how my mother was. So,
it would be, all of us could only be so lucky as to be the first person to see an animal using a tool. But Jane actually saw another animal using a tool, right, Jane? The African vultures, like 4 years later?
Yes, the Egyptian vulture.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And that was right out on the Serengeti, where people had been doing research all these years. And here, Hugo and I were driving across the Serengeti, and there was there'd been a fire, so there was about 8 ostrich eggs that were left on the blackened ground. And there were these Egyptian vultures picking up stones about this big and throwing them at the egg until it broke. It was like magic.
Your whole life is like that.
Nobody had seen it before. It was incredible. So then we discovered other animals that could use tools, and now we know animals can use tools.
Well, the scientific community is still sort of catching up to some of your insights. I mean, there just recently was a big study published that confirmed that chimpanzees have personalities in the wild and in captivity. I mean, this is like last month this study came out.
That's right.
Based on some of your research in Tanzania. How does it feel? Is it frustrating to have the scientific community be so far behind what you realized so many years ago?
Well, that particular study, even before that, people had been able to get PhDs studying personality. So, but some science has lagged behind. But it's kind of like, now finally they believe, now finally it's proved.
I'm curious, let's talk a little bit more about your mom coming with you. Did you have to convince her? Was she game right away to go?
Oh, straight away. I mean, yeah, it was a good family I was born into.
And you had this dream of going to Africa since you were a girl, which again, I think we've established, very strange. At the time, did people, when you told your friends?
They laughed. It was impossible. How would I get there,
But Jane, were you thinking, I just want to go back to something, like this dream of going to Africa, were you actually imagining that you were going to be sitting in a tree observing animals and like writing notes about them?
I don't know what I thought. Probably, yes. I don't know. I mean, I just wanted to be with animals and write books about them. And if somebody had offered me an opportunity to study any animal, I would have jumped at it. In fact, I would love to have studied elephants.
Elephants?
Yes.
Yeah.
When I got there and met them.
What about dogs? You love dogs.
I love dogs, and for a while, I thought if I can't go to Africa, I'm going to go to North America and try and study wolves. I read Jack London's Call of the Wild as a child. So that was second after Africa was Canada.
You had no other plan B?
Well, no, not really.
Was there a dream of getting married? Like, did you have, because at that time.
It wasn't a dream of being married, it was just what girls did in those days.
But was that part of your plan?
No, it wasn't part of my plan. I didn't think about it. It happened. That's how we were brought up. You did whatever you did, and a white knight came along and swept you up and married you.
But in a way, that is what happened to you, because
yes, it did.
It just happened to happen to you in Tanzania, while you were there. But it's one of the most thrilling parts of the film, this love story. And as you said, Brett, one of the more interesting parts of it, the idea that you guys bonded over the fact that you were both so committed to your professions, which also was very rare at the time. And talk a little bit about your early life there with Hugo, and we'll see I think a clip of him in a little bit. But tell me about how you realized that this was a person who shared your passion.
Well, when I first heard Geographic was sending a filmmaker, I wasn't at all happy, because this was my kingdom, and the chimps knew me, and would it disrupt them to have somebody filming them? But that this Geographic were giving the money, and the money came with a filmmaker. So, okay, that's what you do. And I very quickly found out, he spoke quietly, and he loved animals. He told me how he'd gone out as a young boy and filmed, I think they were wild sheep somewhere, I can't remember where, in Austria or something. And he fitted in rather well.
Sounds like an understatement. Let's watch another clip of your time then.
Well, she was all the things that a chimp mother should be. She was protective, but not overprotective. She was affectionate, she was playful, but being supportive. That was the key. And of course, that's what my mother was. She supported me. And there's no question but those close contacts with Flo and her family were very important to my own development. It was just so amazing to have this sort of relationship.
So one of the things that's notable is that we scientists do not interact with animals that closely now. It's not the way it's done. You know, there's dangers of disease and things like that being passed back and forth.
But we didn't know that back then. I mean, this was completely new. And can you imagine when your subject has been running away, and then you can have this kind of relationship with them? It was just magical.
Yeah.
And we fed bananas, and that's something you wouldn't do today, and we don't do it anymore, of course. Because, by the way, the Gombe research continues. Now it's 57 years into the study. But you see, if we hadn't done the banana feeding, Hugo wouldn't have got the footage he got, and the money would have come to an end, and that would have been the end of the study. So when you look back on things, like when I was young and I left school and there was no money for university, I had to earn some money, and so we had our mum had enough money for a secretarial course. Totally boring, shorthand, typing, bookkeeping. But when I met Louis Leakey, his secretary had just left. He needed a secretary, and that's how I got in. So you think things fit in your life. Well, in mine.
When I look at that scene, I mean, I've been working on this footage for 3 years, and I still get goosebumps when I look at that stuff. And, you know, I like to say that when I die, I really hope I see Jane's life flash before my eyes. It's never ceases to, I mean, I sit through the movie, I shouldn't even admit this, I sit through the movie a lot, like in public, because I'm still amazed that it exists, that the footage exists, that she did this. It's so, it blows my mind that she did what she did, and it was captured on film. It's like going to the moon.
It blows my mind too. It really does. I mean, it is.
It's
like
right?
It was all.
Why you?
Why me?
Yeah, why did you get to do it? Like, like you were, of everyone in the history, you were the one selected to go and do that. Why did you?
I know, isn't it strange? I mean, this is something I keep asking myself, why me? Why did it happen to me? So it's now, now that I left Gombe to try and do what I could for conservation, to save the planet that we're busy destroying. And it's almost like a mission. I mean, I'm pushed.
I think we know why you. I think there is a larger purpose as to why you were selected to go in there. And I think your rest of your life has sort of shown that.
Do you miss having that kind of closeness with animals?
Oh, those were the best days of my life, without any question. And of course, I go back to Gombe, but I don't know all the younger generation and almost every single one that I knew. Not quite all, but they've gone. So.
But a few are still around, right? A few?
Yes, there's a few.
A few of the chimps that she lived with are still
well,
around.
it's the offspring of the original Flo's and Melissa's, yeah.
One of the things also that's most moving, I think, about the film is how you talk about how watching the chimp families interact, how it affected you and your own parenting.
It's very interesting that in chimp society there's good mothers and bad mothers, and mostly not very bad, but mediocre. And the fascinating thing is that the good mothers, they're affectionate, they're protective but not overprotective, they're playful. When I watched the chimp mothers playing with their young, I thought, that's fun. If I have a child, I'm going to play with my child and have fun, which I did. But the key thing is the good mothers are supportive, and they will risk being harmed themselves to run in and protect the child and support the child if it gets into a muddle, and which is just what my mother did for me. And so when we look back over the years, the offspring of those supportive mothers, they're more self-assured. The females make better mothers. The males rise higher in the hierarchy and probably sire more kids as a result.
What other lessons do you use from watching chimp behavior in your day-to-day life?
I don't know that I use any. I mean, I think the one thing I learned from chimps is they're so like us biologically and behaviorally, closer than any other creature. And so once you get to that closeness, there's a platform to say, yeah, but we're different, so what is it that makes us different? This is the thing that I find fascinating. And the thing that makes us most different, I think, is the explosive development of our intellect, probably triggered by the fact that at some point in our evolution, we developed language so we can discuss problems, we can teach kids about things that aren't there, we can make plans for the future, we can get together and say, how do we stop drilling in the Arctic refuge for oil? And how do we... Anyway, so isn't it bizarre that the most intellectual being on the planet is destroying its only home? We've sent a rocket to Mars. We know what it looks like up there. We don't want to live. Do you want to live there? No, it doesn't look at all appealing. We've only got this one beautiful planet, at least in the lifetimes of any of us and our children. There won't be a chance of living on another planet. And we're destroying it all the time. And some administrations come along and make it even worse. Not only in the US, I have to say, in the UK and Australia. I mean, it's awful. We seem to have a disconnect between this clever brain and the human heart, love and compassion.
Well, one of your guiding principles we've talked about before is that we hear a lot about terrible things happening to the earth, and it's important to know about that stuff, but it's also important to know about the positive and what people are doing.
Very important.
Is that one of what you see as one of your missions now, to share some of that stuff?
Yeah, but my mission seems to be to give people hope, because if we lose hope, then we do nothing. We fall into apathy. And a lot of people, I think there's much, much more awareness today as to what's going on around the planet than there was, say, even 10 years ago. But people don't change their behavior because they don't know what to do, and they feel helpless and hopeless. And so, the important thing is to realize that every single day, each one of us makes an impact, and we get to choose what sort of impact will we make. And it may seem, okay, what difference can it possibly make if I decide I won't use plastic, or if I turn off all the lights, or, these sort of things. And it wouldn't if it was just me, but it's not. There's hundreds, thousands, millions, eventually billions of people making the right ethical, small choices each day is going to change the world.
Absolutely.
And your film I think this film that you've made, you've captured so much of the beauty of the world as the natural world as it is. This is something people are going to say, we must save it, we must protect it, this is beautiful.
One thing I could say, when we went to Gombe, Berkey and I went to Gombe last summer, it was almost unrecognizable from the film in the most positive way. Because in the film, I think there had just been some burnings in the hills, and it was very barren. And when we went there, it was much lusher than it appeared in the film, which I think, thanks to what you've been doing there, you can see the immediate effects of what you've done.
But when I first went, on the other hand, Brett, Gombe was part of this forest that stretched from East Africa to the West African coast. And when I flew over in 1990 and looked down, it was a 30-square-mile island of forest surrounded by completely bare hills, and more people living there than the land could support, which is why we began our program to improve the lives of the people, because otherwise it was clear we couldn't even try to save the chimps. But fortunately, we managed to get some money and did improve the lives of the people in ways that they suggested. And so they came to become, they're now our partners in conservation. And they've set land aside for regeneration. And that's the magic. These little seeds from the trees that were once there and were cut down or burned, they stay in the ground and give it a chance. And these little seeds, it is like magic. They are resurrected and they become trees again.
Is anybody feeling like they might cry when Jane is talking? So I learned from meeting Jane before that is something called the Jane effect, right?
Yes.
She makes people cry. You're okay with it, right?
I meet people in airports and coffee shops, and they say, "Are you Jane Good?" I'm sorry.
If I could share a funny story, when I was interviewing Jane, the last question at the end of the couple days, it wasn't really a question, it was just a comment I wanted to make to her, which is if the goal, if our purpose on this planet is to just try to leave it a little bit better, my God, what this woman has done for all of us. It was a very simple sentiment, and I couldn't, and this is after sitting with her for a couple days straight, like one-on-one, and I couldn't get the words out of my mouth. The thought overwhelmed me, and I started crying. And Jane very sweetly handed me some Kleenex. And after about 4 minutes, she said, "Don't worry, it happens quite a bit." And so I think after about 6 minutes, I got the question out. We finished the interview, and then Jane, is it okay if I tell the story? Yeah. And then, I don't know why I'm asking you, I'm the one who gets shamed in this story. And then Jane invited us to have a cocktail after we concluded the interview. So Brian Burke, who produced the film with me, we started walking over to Jane's house, and I stopped and I said, "Do you drink?" And he goes, "No, I don't drink." I go, "Me neither." I go, "What are we gonna do? We have to, Jane offered us to have a drink. We have to have a drink with Jane." He was like, "I don't know, we put more water in it or something." I was like, it's like the worst thing you could do if you don't like the taste of alcohol. It's like, okay, fine. So we go and we sit there with Jane and we're having a toast, and I said, "Oh, Jane, just so you know, you probably have not drank with two guys who are more soft than we are. We really can't hold our liquor." And Brian said, "Yeah, Jane, I mean, it's embarrassing." And she goes, "Well, I don't know about you, but he is definitely a crybaby." It's like, "Jane, I just poured my heart out to you."
And your tears.
All right,
But right at the beginning, when this began to happen, it was awful. It was. I didn't know how to deal with it, And then I realized that she made me cry. We're laughing now, but I realized that there's two Janes, and there's that one has become a kind of icon. The Geographic created it. Hugo's film created it. You've made it even worse. But you know, so that's, and then there's me that's talking to you, being silly and all that kind of stuff. And so I have to try and live up to that icon, because that icon is what's helping me to change people. And so it's one person divided into two, trying to make one again. I don't know, I can't really understand it.
I think more people are crying now that you've said that. All right, we're going to have a time for audience questions. There'll be 2 mics. We'll start over here so you guys can line up, and we'll go that way. I want to talk about one other thing. You know, the footage is so magnificent, in part because Hugo was an incredible cinematographer, but also, you know, there's some shots where you're eating, you're doing things that maybe were not natural. Were there moments when he directed you at all to do that?
Oh, he was directed by the Geographic. You must film Jane eating. You must film Jane washing her hair in the stream. You must film Jane walking along the beach. There was this whole series of things.
Tell them about the bathing suit.
Yes, they wanted him to film me bathing in the lake, and I said no. The rest you can do.
But you knew what to do in these moments, you know, aside from the bathing suit thing where you said no, because you had experience in working in film production, right?
Well, it was only, these were advertising films. And it was very funny. Back then, I mean, you couldn't do it today, but they made one film for Aristoc stockings, and it was the film that the advertisement said, these stockings don't wrinkle. In the old days when you had suspender belts and things. So one of my jobs was to paint the seam on the back of the stocking on the bare leg to show it didn't wrinkle.
So you knew all about camera tricks, all the magic.
I knew camera tricks, yes.
One of my favorite moments of the film, if you've seen the film, is when Jane and Hugo are falling in love. And most of the shots that we used to illustrate them falling in love were these moments that were intended to be staged moments, but then Hugo would let the camera roll and Jane would turn to the camera, or you could sense that Hugo was saying something off camera that made her laugh. And it's the difference between, I think, the honesty of the 65 film and the film today is that they cut at those moments and never wanted anyone to see them. Yeah. And we embrace those moments and were in awe of those moments, that we can actually watch 2 people falling in love through the lens of a camera. I mean, it was a real revelation to discover.
Yeah, an incredible romance.
Oh, and the other lovely thing I love about this film is seeing Grub again when he was little. I mean, wasn't he gorgeous?
He was.
I mean, he was complete. And I said to him, I said, you know, you were beautiful, weren't you, when you were a baby? And he said, yeah, I was.
It's like out of central casting. I mean, it was
yeah,
crazy.
I know.
Yeah. Hugo, too. Hugo was incredibly handsome.
Yes, he was pretty good looking.
All right, we have a question over here. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much for coming. My name is Steve Fredericks. I've been a fan of yours for probably close to 50 years, so it's very exciting for me to be standing here. And I don't think I'm going to cry, but I am terribly excited to be here. And I wanted to ask a question related to your recent biography that I read, in which there's a section towards the middle of the first half of the biography where you describe your experience at Gombe after your mother's left, where you find yourself becoming more deeply immersed in the natural environment, and you begin to name the trees and the streams and the mountain peaks and things, which I envy deeply. I've done some camping and things and been in the woods, and I know, you know, like a little of what you were referring to. And I'm wondering if you could share, for me and the rest of the audience, anything you remember about that shift of consciousness, which I think you liken to somewhat of a spiritual experience, but you clearly enjoyed it a great deal, and I'd love to hear anything you have to say about it live.
Well, I think it was after the Geographic came in and said, we'll continue to fund your research. So the pressure was off in a way. I knew I had time. I didn't have to every single day be so concentrated on, I must find the chimps, I must see the chimps. So the beauty of the surroundings were not so impinging on me at that time. But afterwards, and especially after Mum had gone, and I was basically on my own, you know, that's when the spiritual experience of the forest hit me. And it is very spiritual. You also recognize the fact that everything out in the rainforest is interrelated and entwined, and each little species has its role to play, and even an insignificant one. And they all together form the tapestry, this great, glorious tapestry of life in the forest. And I had time to sit by that incredible waterfall where the chimpanzees sometimes do their waterfall displays or their waterfall dances, which is so completely, I mean, if they could speak this emotion that impels them to do these upright, swaying, beautiful dances, if they could talk to each other about it, might lead to an early religion, animistic religion, when people used to worship the sun, the stars, the things they couldn't understand. So I had time to really get this feeling, and I became part of the natural world.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I don't know about you, I got a little teary-eyed on that response.
All right, we'll go over here and I'll just say, I see we have a lot of people who want to ask questions. We have limited time, so please try as much as you can to keep your questions short. Thank you.
Jane, can you offer any thoughts or anecdotes about the extent, if any, that living with chimps for so long might have affected in any way your relationship with humans?
Well, I certainly find myself watching humans, perhaps in a different way to many other people. No, I notice when I first began to lecture, I was so terrified. I knew I couldn't do it. In fact, I could, but I knew I couldn't, you know. And there was often one of these things which I still don't like, a dinner before a lecture, because I don't like eating before I lecture. And so while I was at this dinner and I couldn't eat, but everybody else was eating, I was watching the way people were eating and thinking about the chimps. And very, very often I compare little things that people do with the chimps. Yeah, I do. So yes, it made me more observant of people, definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Over here, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Carly. I'm an interdisciplinary science major here, and I just would like to know the best advice you could give to young scientists, especially young women who are going into conservation, especially in the face of so many obstacles that our current world is facing.
I think the problem today is there's a lot of competition. More and more and more people, women and men, want to go and help conservation. And it's not easy to get a job. So the only thing I can say to young people who want to go into this field is you must really want to do it. And you know, you may have to wait quite a while, and you may have to struggle and fight to get a grant. But to begin by being a volunteer, if you can afford it, but a lot of people go out and do boring old work to get a bit of money so they can volunteer for 3 months or something. And also that if you have this dream and this is what you want to do, you may not be able to go straight to it, but don't forget the dream and do something else and then wait for the opportunity and then dive in.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask a related question from Facebook, and then I'll go to you. Lindsay from Facebook asks, do you think women have an easier time in the field of science now?
I think they have a much, well, there's women in the field of science, they weren't there before, so since they weren't there before, maybe they have a more difficult time, I don't know. But anyway, they're much more accepted than they used to be everywhere, I think.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Siri, and I'm a sophomore here at the new school. I was just wondering, as someone who's interested in scientific literacy, how do we make people more aware and more emotionally tied to the future of the planet in order to conserve it?
Well, I think the way, one way that doesn't work, if you find somebody who doesn't agree with you, if you find somebody who thinks animals don't have personalities or whatever it happens to be, there's not much use arguing with them intellectually, because as soon as you begin to argue, they don't want to listen, they want to refute you, so they're thinking of what they're going to say. So the only way I found is to tell stories. And the most important thing is to spend a few minutes finding out who this person is, what they're like. Just try and find something, get a sense of who they are, and then tell a story. You've got to get into the heart to change people. At least that's what I've found.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Emily Mills, and I'm 11 years old, and I had a question about what advice would you give to an 11-year-old like me about how to have a positive change on the world?
How to change the world? Well, I think a very important thing is for you to find out, maybe do you know about our youth program, Roots and Shoots?
Yes, I do.
Well then, Roots and Shoots, if you stay with it, you meet so many other people who want to change the world. But what I'm going to tell you, have you joined Roots and Shoots?
Not yet.
Not yet. When you do, and even before you do, like now, just remember that every single day you live, you make a difference on the planet. So the main message of Roots and Shoots is that each one of us has a role to play, even if we don't yet know what it is. Each one of us matters, and each one of us makes a difference every single day. So we can't all, you can be a CEO of a big company and make a decision that will affect millions of people for good or for bad. Most of us don't do that, but we can choose, think about the consequences of the little choices we make each day. What do we buy? What do we eat? What do we wear? Did its production harm the environment? Did it cause suffering to animals? Was it cheap because it's child slave labor? Start thinking about those things and making those ethical choices. And when billions of people make those ethical choices, you will be changing the world.
Hi, Jane. I'm Elizabeth, and I'm 9 years old, and I always wanted to be a vet. And do you still have your stuffed animal, Jubilee?
Jubilee sits at home. He's now, 81 years old. He doesn't travel anymore. He's too delicate. He's not aged as well as I have. But I'll tell you something, Jubilee has, for those of you who don't know, he was the toy chimpanzee I was given when I was 18 months old. And my parents' friend said, you can't give Jane that, she'll be terrified, because he's this big, And he was named Jubilee because he was the first chimpanzee born in London Zoo. But inside him, he had a music box. And it's one where you squeeze like this, and it plays a lovely old tune. That still works today as well as it ever did. It's amazing. So somebody wanted to replicate him, and without asking, they cut open down his back to take the music box out to see, but it turns out to be Swiss-made. They sewed it all up again, but he now has a scar down his back. But he's fine.
Okay, go ahead, over here.
Hi there. So in a pivotal part of the film, one of Flo's child passes away shortly after she dies. He's a grown adult. So you seem to suggest in the film that he died of sadness. Can you give like an explanation of that?
I couldn't hear.
She was asking about when Flint dies. In the film, it suggested that Flint dies because of sadness.
Right. Do you have an
Because of his mother
explanation
died. She was.
Yeah, do you just have an explanation for...
Well, yes, because he was obviously suffering from depression.
Right.
And when people get very depressed, the immune system weakens and you sicken. And he definitely got sick from something, but, you know, he wasn't eating. He was just desperately depressed. And it seemed he couldn't live without his mother, so he got sick and died.
Is it common for chimps to be that attached?
It's very common for infants who lose their mothers to become depressed. But Flint, unfortunately, didn't have an older brother or sister handy to adopt him and look after him. So, and also, he was 8 years old. And normally when an infant loses the mother and they're adopted, they're younger and they're more resilient.
Thanks. Hi there.
Hi, I'm Catherine. I'm 11 years old. So, what was the happiest time in your life? What age were you when it happened?
She asked what was the happiest time in your life? How old were you?
Well, I think the happiest time in my life was after I got my PhD and I went back to Gombe and I built up the research station and the students were there and I could spend, every day I spent time out in the forest and I had my dear little baby, you know, watching him grow and looking after him and being a mother. I think those were the happiest days of my life, and I was 28, I think. But I was happy as a child too, very happy. And I was out walking on the cliffs with Rusty. Rusty's the best dog I've ever known. I've had many. I can't have a dog now. That's my saddest thing. I can't take a dog with me.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have time for just a couple more.
Hi, I have a question for you. As a youth, I was a huge fan of Edgar Rice Burroughs, and I read pretty much every Tarzan book that ever existed. And it's hard because every film that's ever been done about Tarzan has been sort of a cliche and one-dimensional and really didn't get into the sense of what was going on in his books and in his perspective. And I was curious if, well, just to thank you for bringing me into that world through your vision and the things that you've done. And watching your movie was amazing to see you living in that world and respecting what animals and their kind of relation to each other was. And I was just curious whether you read him as a child as well.
Did you read the Tarzan books?
Did I read it?
The Edgar Rice Burroughs Tarzan books, yes.
Yeah, well, you know, it started with Dr. Dolittle.
Ah.
And Dr. Dolittle, I think everybody should read the story of Dr. Dolittle. And it says an awful lot about studying animals and how you watch them and how you observe them. Tarzan, you know, when I was growing up, there was no TV, obviously.
Right.
And we had books and we had the radio and we had our elders to tell stories to us about what their lives had been like. That was it. Oh, you know, we used to spend hours with encyclopedias and things. And so we had very little money, the war was raging, and I used to save up. I think we had a couple of pennies a week pocket money. I saved it up, and I found this little secondhand bookshop. And I found this little book, it was about this big, I still have it, and it was called Tarzan of the Apes. And I took it home and I read it and I fell passionately in love with that glorious Lord of the Jungle. And what did he do? He went and married the wrong Jane. But that is when my dream really crystallized. I will go to Africa, I will live with animals, and I will write books about them. And I reread it recently, and it's so filled with violence. But there's lots of killing of animals and Tarzan fighting animals. And back then, I think most of the books I read were the early hunters going out, and it was all a lot of violence and killing, but I don't know. Now I hate it.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi there. So you were pivotal, in changing a lot of people's minds about how they thought about a subject pertaining to chimpanzees. As a young person trying to help people change their minds on how they should be living their everyday life in relation to climate change, what do you think is the best way to make people see something different from what they might think it is? It's kind of a hard question. Sorry, it was wordy.
The people.
What is the best way for you to get people to envision a world different than it is? Is that
what you... Well, again, I think it's stories. And again, this film, that's a world that is disappearing, and we've got to save it. So I think the best way is... and again, I think the thing we have to realize is when you're talking to people, they're all different. And you must find who they are before you can try and change the way they think, if you think they're thinking wrong. My mother always taught me, if you find somebody who disagrees with you, the first and most important thing is to listen to them. And maybe, just maybe, you'll think, well, gosh, they do have a point. So you always have to be prepared to, not to think I'm always going to be right, because one isn't always right, and new information comes along, and there's no harm in changing your mind. But some people feel that it's going to demean themselves if they change their mind, so they go on hanging on to what they have been saying they believe. Like, I don't believe in climate change. Well, you can't look around the world now and not realize that, of course, you made a mistake if you say you don't believe in climate change. So better to admit it.
I'm going to add one Facebook question to that. Kate from Facebook says, how would you respond to the current US administration's denial of climate change?
Well, they have changed a little bit in saying, well, yes, the climate may be changing, but we haven't had much to do with it. So as they seem not to be prepared to look at the scientific evidence, which is massive from all around the world, I'm not sure that, I think they're in a different planet. I mean, I don't know. I don't know how you change somebody who's so obstinate and probably inside themselves. Like, when I met these professors in Cambridge University who said that only humans had personality, mind, and emotion, I don't think they really believed it, but they felt they couldn't prove it. With these people who deny climate change or anything else like that, I tell them stories. I tell them how I've watched the Greenland ice melting, how I've seen people on islands having to leave their island homes because with high tide they're no longer habitable. It surely is getting harder to have that conviction after all these terrible hurricanes and floodings, and so it's a mystery to me. Do you have any idea, Brett? How would you change somebody's mind who said they don't believe in us harming the climate?
I think that's a better question for you, Jane. I think you're more suited. But I think when you start small. I think the film, I think film is a wonderful way to communicate to people. And I think what I learned from you is small steps, baby steps. And as you said to the young girl, we can all make a difference every day in our lives. And the smallest choices, even here in New York, can help save the planet. So I think it begins at home, like everything else.
Everybody walk home or take the subway. No Ubers. Okay. All right, we're going to try and wrap up, but I see that there are a couple people, so let's if we can make our quick questions short, we can get to everybody.
Sure. I have to say that your work inspired me to become a veterinarian. And one thing that I know we've struggled with when we work with wildlife is when to intervene versus when to let nature take its course, and how our responsibility has shifted now that we've encroached and damaged so much habitat, and how that might be different from when you were in the field.
I'm not hearing very well. What was?
She's asking how to deal with the struggle of when to intervene as a veterinarian or a scientist,
to intervene
and
part
when
in
to
this.
let nature take its course.
Well, I think personally that when you're dealing with an animal, it should be much the same as a human, only we can perhaps help animals more easily than we can help humans who are suffering. I've always felt at Gombe with the chimps, I was told you mustn't intervene, you must let them, let nature take its course. But quite honestly, when you're dealing with animals, we've stopped nature taking its course. Nature isn't taking its course anymore. We've interfered. We've introduced diseases. And so I've always felt if I can help a sick chimpanzee, if I can give medication like we did with the polio, we gave them these polio drops, every single chimp. And it was a nightmare because it was a live vaccine. And so if a high-ranking male had had his share, and it had to be 3 times in over 3 weeks, and you were trying to give it to a low-ranking individual, and the high-ranking one came and got that banana, then you might kill him. He might get polio. So it was difficult, but still we managed. There wasn't a single chimp who got 2 doses. So yes, I think you should always help if you can, definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? I see a little guy. Come on out.
Come up nice and close.
What do you remember of the first days of being in Africa?
Good question.
Well, my first days I remember being in Africa, of course, weren't Gombe. They were when Leakey took me to the Serengeti, where he was searching for fossils in this place called Olduvai Gorge. And in those days, all the animals were there. It was just like a paradise. And for me, that was, my first feeling of really, really, really being in the Africa of my dreams. And there was one other young English girl and me, and Leakey and his wife, and a few Kenyans. And in the 3 months we were there, we only saw 4 other human beings, and they were 4 Maasai warriors. And Gillian and I were allowed out on the plains every evening after the hard day's work, looking for fossils. And one evening there was a rhino, and he was about as near to us as this wall, but luckily rhinos don't see very well. And luckily the wind was blowing from him to us, and so he trotted away in the other direction. And then one evening it was a young male lion, fully grown, mane beginning to grow on his shoulders. He was about 2 years old, I think. And he'd never seen anything like me and Gillian before. And he followed us, I would say, twice the length of this whole theater, which is quite a long way. So it was a bit scary, but it was very exciting. And I think it was that evening around the campfire that Leakey decided I was the person he'd been looking for to study the chimps. He said, I behaved exactly in the right way. Gillian she said, we have to go down, we have to go into the bottom of the gorge where the vegetation's thick. And I said, well, that won't be much good because the lion will see us, but we won't see him. I said, no, I think we should climb up the side, up onto the open plains, and that's what we did. Leakey said that was exactly the right thing to do. But it was magic. It was complete magic those days.
Well, on that note, everybody go home and dream about that moment. Thank you all. You've been a great audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you.